What's that outside your door, banging so hard that you think it might splinter? It might just be one of those pesky skin-walking creatures that have been plaguing people for what seems like centuries. Whether you live in America or anywhere else in the world it seems these days, these creatures are running around being the boogeyman everywhere you turn. Welcome back to the swamp, my friends. It's good to see you back for another episode. Today, these stories were of course sent in by viewers just like you. If you have an encounter with an alleged skinwalker creature, or maybe just have a different scary story entirely, be sure to submit yours at swampdweller.net or the email you can find in the description down below. I'd love to share your story here with everyone in the swamp. It's stories like yours that help keep this channel going. Now, without further ado, sit back, relax, and get ready to submerge yourself in the mucky waters of the bog. So I have submitted 3 stories to you, and you have graciously read 2 of them on your channel. My name is Evan, and the 2 stories you read were about cryptids, and so is this story. The difference is that this story is from my mom's point of view. As I stated in the last 2 stories, I live in rural Maryland, but my mom grew up in the mountains of Tennessee. Her father was an avid hunter and cared for his family very well. They lived on a large section of woodland near a dirt road, in a log A-frame home. Her father worked at car auctions and was often gone for weeks at a time on road trips with his team. This led to my mother Lisa becoming a very accustomed person to exploring the woods with her sister. Her mom took care of the property, but also worked at a local restaurant 4 days out of the week. Again, this left my mom and her sister with the task of occupying themselves. My mom loved the outdoors and the woods surrounding her home. It was perfect for exploring. Her father whittled a small wooden slingshot for her, and she would spend all day shooting pebbles at the creek and climbing small trees. Now, this encounter took place when my mom was 9, in July of the year 1979. My grandma had taken my mom's sister to the doctor because she had sprained her ankle the day prior and was having trouble walking. My mom decided, like most days, that she would do some deep woods exploring. She grabbed her slingshot and set out. Her mom called after her to not be too late for dinner. The sun was already getting low in the sky and the thick trees didn't help this matter. My mom wasn't scared of the dark. She ran through the brambles, singing and stopping every once in a while to shoot her slingshot. She eventually got to the creek and sat down on the soft bank to refill her pebble supply. As she was picking up pebbles, she heard a noise. Whenever she retells this to me or any sibling, she always says, "It's like the crickets lost their voice and the birds had no more songs to sing." The forest was utterly silent, as she recalled, and she didn't realize why at first. She got up from the creek bank. Standing across the creek on the other side of the bank is what she called a big hairy man. She wasn't familiar with the stories about Bigfoot, but she knew this was no human. It looked at her and she said it felt like it was staring right through her soul. Then it let out a massive, guttural call that she felt in her chest. She tried to cry, being a little girl in the deep woods with a Bigfoot in front of her. As if the thing realized it scared her, it stood up to its full height and she realized it was only kneeling. She said it must have been 6 feet tall while on its knees, but around 9 feet standing up. As my mom turned to run, she heard it let out another call, even louder than the first one. My mom got back to the house in record speed, and her clothes were torn and her legs were bloody from tripping twice. When my grandma asked why and what had happened, she said she fell from a tree. I don't think she thought my grandma would believe her. She never told this story until maybe about 5 years ago. I was shocked but believed her because my mom is no liar. So, that's her story. I appreciate you sharing my stories I've sent you, and I hope you can share this one as well. I hope you're doing well during this crazy time, and be safe out there, folks, because there are some things that we just can't explain in life. I am an avid outdoorsman and a fellow swamp dweller. I was once a well-known outdoor survivalist YouTuber from the early years of YouTube, when 10K subscribers was a lot. so I won't be using any names just in case a few of you may remember us. This took place in Florida back in 2010 during the summer. Me and two friends were camping on the Alafia River, on a bend in the river not too far downstream from a county park built around a local spring. We loved the spot, and went there frequently in the early years of our channel. The area is much more developed now, and since we made videos out there, the place lost its charm as more and more people have discovered it. We seldom go back now. This particular trip, we decided to camp right on the river in a spot that afforded a beautiful view of it, and the surrounding flora and fauna. To get there, you just had to follow the trail that eventually went down an embankment and turned to run along the river for a dozen yards or so. We usually camped atop said embankment and even had semi-permanent shelter up for a while, but decided to go down and set up camp along the river trail instead. We set up camp, gathered wood, started our fire, cooked, drank, and relaxed. Night eventually fell, and we all turned in around the same time. I believe it was around 10 p.m. or so. We had of course been telling stories of the skunk ape, which is Sasquatch's smaller and smellier cousin from Florida. I have an odd habit of not being able to sleep much when I go camping unless I am the first person to fall asleep. If not, I kind of just doze off and wake up every few minutes. I'm never really ever asleep. In this case, I was not the first one out. I soon heard soft snoring from the other tent shared by my two companions on this weekend trip. So I settled into a comfortable position in my little dome tent and drifted between wakefulness and sleep for a few hours. Always keeping an ear out. One thing about rainy Florida summer nights is the sounds of the swamp. Being right off the river, there was a constant cacophony of frogs, toads, crickets, and the odd nocturnal bird, all screaming into the night as they try to get laid. While it can be loud, there is a natural rhythm to it that I enjoyed. There were even some coyotes yipping somewhere off and across the river from us. Suddenly, all the sound ceased. I came fully awake and laid still for just a moment, eyes open as I tried to puzzle out what was off. It was when I heard the gentle trickle of water from the river that I realized everything had gone quiet. I sat up and tried my best to peek out from under the rain fly of my tent, which was covering the screen. I would normally be able to see out of it, but I could not see more than just a sliver. It was so dark outside, it really didn't help anything either. I heard crunching and the rustling of leaves on the embankment above us, in the spot that we would normally camp. I listened for a moment, figuring it was either the raccoon I had chased off earlier with the slingshot, or, even more likely, an armadillo, which was abundant in our area and can make enough noise in the brush to make you think it was a bear charging at you. It was then that I noticed the crunching was following the pattern of a person walking through the brush on two legs, not the slithering rustle of a small game moving around. At this point, I figured either one of my companions was up trying to spook me, or a local had come out and was walking around at night with no flashlight, which was a pretty disturbing and questionable prospect in and of itself. The footfalls moved across the embankment above me towards the top of the trail that led down to where we were. My tent was set up in the grass at the base of the trail, right where it leveled off and turned to follow the river. My companion's tent was set up a few yards away on the left of the trail. The footfalls made it to the top of the trail and stopped. They were maybe 10 or 12 feet away from where I sat. My trepidation grew as seconds passed in eerie silence. There was a sudden loud crack of wood from the embankment above me, the unmistakable sound of a tree branch being whacked and broken against the trunk of a tree. I knew this for certain because we had been doing the same thing earlier in order to break down large dead branches of firewood. Another whack sounded, this time closer to my tent. I reached over and quietly scooped up my large Maglite LED flashlight and my machete. I placed them both in my lap as I sat up. I was sitting cross-legged, waiting patiently. I usually carried a pistol with me, but left it in the car on this trip for a reason I can no longer recall. The footfalls at the top of the trail started again, one after another. This time I could feel the weight of them in the seat of my pants as they came. This thing was heavy. The ground vibrated with the thump under its weight with each step. My skin began to prickle as my neck and ears grew hot with the sudden rush of fear. The footfalls stopped within an arm's reach of my tent. I listened hard and thought that I could make out the faint sound of something breathing quietly. Ragged, in the darkness outside, I knew it was focused on me. The crushing weight of its attention drove me to near panic, as though some long-forgotten instinct woke inside me and knew that I needed to get out of here. It needed me to run. It's the only survival. My breathing grew rapid and shallow, my chest tight as I continued to listen to the dead silence outside of my tent. Then as suddenly as it came, the dreaded weight lifted. I felt and heard the thing move past me down the trail towards my friend's tent. The frogs and crickets resumed, causing me to nearly jump out of my skin at the sudden rush of sound. As the thing moved past me, I was able to will myself to the flap of my tent where I slowly unzipped it enough from the top corner in order to get my flashlight through. I clicked my flashlight on and kept a tight grip on my machete as the bright LED beam lit up the night like a white mini sun. I swept it back and forth and saw nothing of what had just passed. Still too scared to get out, I zipped my tent up and resumed my cross-legged position. For the rest of the night, flashlight and machete held across my lap in case it came back. Dawn came 2.5 hours later. I heard the zipper of the other tent open, so I also emerged. I saw my friend exit his tent, bleary-eyed as he moved off into the thicket of bushes to relieve himself in the pre-dawn light. I approached and asked him if he heard anything last night. He said he did, but he figured it was me walking around trying to creep them out. Told them it wasn't. He kind of shrugged it off and went back into his tent. I stayed outside and searched for signs of the thing, and I found nothing. No tracks or depressions in the ground, no bent or broken branches or twigs, no tufts of fur or hair, nothing. When my companions fully awoke and emerged from their tent for breakfast, I addressed it with them again, and they again said they just thought it was me walking around. I described what I felt, but only got looks of disbelief from them. Something to note about this experience: there was no smell, which is of something of a telltale sign of a skunk ape in the other folks' accounts of running into one. The only thing that really points it to being a skunk ape would be the tree knocking, and the one thing that makes me dismiss it as a person was the feeling of dread that it brought with it. I have never felt anything like what I did that night. I had once been stalked by an elusive Florida panther, and it was nothing close to this thing. What was it? I may never know. Camping and hiking in the backcountry has always been my passion since I was old enough to go out on my own and travel to different locations. I've been fortunate enough in my life to be able to go to some of the most remote and beautiful places in the United States. Needless to say, I've seen some pretty strange things, and at times I've been downright terrified of the encounters I've had out in the bush. I've always believed in the supernatural and the unexplained, having grown up in an extremely haunted house which sat on an old Native American reservation. But that's a story for another time. With all that being said, I still can't begin to explain what happened to me and one of my closest friends in the mountains of Arizona one night. After a long week of work, my friend John and I decided we would go to a well-known mountain range just north of Phoenix to hit up some of the off-road Jeep trails and spend the weekend camping at one of my favorite spots. For obvious reasons, I won't disclose the exact location, but if you live in the area, you probably know exactly where I'm talking about. After a few hours of driving across the rough terrain, we finally arrived at the trailhead. We parked our Jeeps and gathered our gear and began our half-an-hour hike to the campsite. The trailhead is not well known or heavily used at all. I've gone to the spot for years, and hell, sometimes I still drive right past it if I'm not looking hard enough. After a while of hiking, we finally reached the campsite. Now, this place is absolutely beautiful. It's right on the edge of the mountain overlooking the Salt River, and usually, there's not another soul for miles. I've made countless solo trips here and have always felt at ease, even after a close encounter with a mountain lion coming inside of my camp. But this time, I don't know, something was definitely off, and I could tell that John felt it too because he was a lot more tense than usual and seemed to be on high alert. We tried to brush it off and ignore it as best as we could, and got our campsite set up. After a few beers and sitting around a small fire later that night, we started to relax just a bit. It was starting to get late, so I decided I was going to call it a night. Just as I started to stand up, a rock the size of a baseball comes hurling out of the wood and nails a tree right beside my feet. What the heck? I stood there stunned for a second, before reaching for my rifle. John jumped up and pulled out his pistol. "Hey, if there's someone out there, you better make yourself known right now," I yelled as I and John started walking in the direction that rock came from. We got no reply. No sound of footsteps, not even a slight breeze. It was dead silent. So much that my ears were ringing. After a few minutes of investigating the area and finding absolutely nothing, we returned back to the fire and decided it best to stay up and be alert for a little longer in case something else happens. About an hour goes by and John and I are starting to calm down and are just sitting around talking. All of a sudden, a large tree branch flies out of the trees and lands on John's tent, ripping a massive hole in the roof. We jumped up and both aim our guns in the direction that the branch flew in from. We fire a few rounds. Maybe this was not a good idea, but we did it anyway. We hear something massive tearing through the trees. At first we thought it was running away from us, but we realized it was running a circle around us. We shined our lights in all directions, trying to catch a glimpse of whatever or whoever this was messing with us. At this point, we were both shaken up and started gathering what we could to stuff in our packs and get the heck out of there. John grabs my arm and says, "Stop. Do you hear that?" He started looking back towards the edge of the mountain. At first I didn't hear anything, but after a second I could make out a low hum. It was a very low but high-pitched whistle that was vibrating the ground slightly, but it was coming from about 50 feet past the edge of the mountain. Like, there was no possible way anyone or anything could be out there, unless it could fly. I started walking towards the sound slowly, scanning the tree line around me. As we slowly moved towards the edge, I lift up my light and shine it towards the unexplained sound. As I did, rocks and large sticks and even parts of a cactus flew in from off the edge, bombarding us. It was like shrapnel. We ran the full 30-minute hike in about 10 to 15 minutes to our jeeps and threw the few things we managed to grab in the back and just hauled absolute ass out of there. We never went back to the tents, and I haven't been camping in that place ever since. I've heard a lot of scary stories about that area, ranging from Bigfoot to UFOs and even skinwalkers. But after those events, I still have no idea what terrorized us that night. I don't plan on going back to find out, but if you live in the area and know kinda what I'm talking about, if you are unlucky enough to stumble upon an abandoned campsite at the edge of a mountain, do yourself a favor, turn around and go the other way. Hello there. I've been listening to your program for a while and decided to share this. Maybe another listener has had this happen to them, because I still don't really know what this was. I grew up with acres upon acres of woods behind my house. A farmer owned most of it, but no one paid mind to us. There were huge fields on both sides of the woods, and the farmer at one point had trails going through the woods to move cows from one pasture to the other. My brother, sister, and I would regularly be found playing out there. There was a creek back there too. We could fish or swim, or muck-luck, or whatever you want. Muck-lucking is basically playing in the mud, catching frogs and salamanders. We'd been out there in any weather, any season, in the daylight, in the dark, you name it. I used to hike the woods on moonlit nights as a kid and was quite comfortable in its surroundings. The location of my home was in southeastern Pennsylvania, Chester County. The area still had plenty of open space at the time, and wildlife was really just foxes, raccoon, deer, squirrel, etc. Nothing too scary or aggressive, and the coyotes hadn't come back at this point. I'm about 10 or 11 when this occurred. My friend Haley and I had been hiking for most of the morning and had gone up through the hills, through the woods to the top of the pasture. The trees were less there, and they had these huge vines that we used to make swings out of. We had hung out for a while and then headed back down the hill towards the woods. The day was sunny and clear and a really nice autumn day. As we entered the woods and made our way to the trail, the clouds started to move in. It got grayer and a little cold. Nothing major. Haley and I were enjoying shuffling through the leaves, and it sounded like the sound of the leaves were being echoed, like we'd shuffle and something would shuffle behind us. I stopped and told Haley that something was copying me. She shuffled forward and said, "See, I'm not copying you." After she shuffled, we heard the leaves move behind us up the hill a bit, and we both turned to see if it was a deer or something else. But what we saw was something entirely different. It was like a man deer or a deer man or whatever you would want to call it. It was coming right towards us. We know how protective they get, and we knew that the buck could get a little gnarly too. So, as we were looking, we hear the lowest growl that made the hairs stand up on the back of my neck. Haley grabs my arm and we slowly start backing up. I swear on my mother's grave that we backed up. You could see the leaves moving like something was walking through them, but we couldn't see them actually move. It was only about 30 feet away, and we would move behind trees to try to get a better look while backing up. I was trying to rationalize it in my brain by saying it was just a deer. The leaves moved out of the way of whatever was walking through them, and it was large. It kept coming down the hill just behind us, and the growl came again, louder this time. A growl that rumbled in my chest. We turned tail and bolted it out of those woods as fast as we could, and it felt like this thing was close behind. I can remember Haley falling when we reached the line between the woods and my backyard, and I remember dragging her by the arm until she caught her feet. I was still trying to catch a glance and trying to see if I saw anything, but I still saw nothing chasing us. We ran straight to the house and hid looking from her bedroom window. We had a clear view from her window to our woods, yet nothing ever came out. We didn't go into the woods for a while, and even so, we only enter a couple of feet before we'd feel like we were being watched. My brother and his friend had a similar run-in, but luckily had their quads. They were further in the woods and were fishing, just like our day. He said it started to get cloudy and colder, kind of out of the blue, and he said he heard someone on the trail further down. This is opposite of where the trail goes from our house. It's deeper in towards a waterfall. He said it sounded like someone was riding their horse down towards them. He called out to them because he didn't want the rider or the horse to get spooked since everything is kind of on a bend. Instead of a voice, a growl was the response. He then said he and Gary didn't waste any time. They left all their tackle and poles and flew home on the quads. I hadn't told my brother about what happened to me and Haley, but I think these occurrences are definitely connected. What do you guys think? It was near the end of 2018, sometime around November, so it was damp and pretty cold out, but nonetheless still comfortable for me when I got a call from my friend Joe. He wanted to come up to my house and stay for a few days to get out of the city, so to speak, because I live up in the mountains. The usual middle of nowhere type old wooden house with my mom, who rarely was home for more than 2 to 3 hours at a time due to her job in the mountains of Tennessee, yada yada. You know, backwoods areas, you've heard this story a million times. We have neighbors, but they're a good distance from our house, so we don't know them all that well. Enough details for now, though. So I get off the phone with Joe and proceed to drive to the city where, of course, me and him hang out for a while and play some video games, and slightly we lost track of time. When we left, thanks to the time of year, it was already dark. It was maybe around 6:30 to 7 p.m. when we got back to my place, and it had begun sprinkling rain on the ride up, but we get there no problem. We go in and start setting up the game stations to begin the night of games and movies. Typical stuff we did. It's around 10 p.m. when we have everything set up and slight rain had subsided so we opened up the window to cool the room a bit. The backyard is dark, and I mean dark. It leads straight into the woods beside the small shack in my yard. But it never bothered us because we were halfway through our movie when I and Joe both heard a faint metallic-like sound coming from the woods, which caused Joe to pause the movie and ask if I had heard the noise. I said I had, so we had listened for a moment and heard it again, but it sounded closer. It was windy, so I blamed it on the wind, and plus we have a tin roof, but we resumed the movie and kind of forgot about it until about 30 minutes later when we heard it again, but this time much louder than before. It sounded like someone hitting a metal baseball bat against a tree. So I paused the movie again, and I and Joe just look at each other and decide to stay quiet and turn the lights down and take a look out the window. We saw nothing but keep hearing it move around the woods, so to speak. We started getting a little freaked out, but turned the movie back on and lowered the volume mostly, as a ploy to act as if we were ignoring it again. But we were really listening intently to the outside noises, and the sound quickly stopped. They now transitioned to the side of my house, just under the opened window. We froze, and for what felt like 5 minutes straight, we just stared at my window, seeing nothing but the darkness and slight glow of the floodlight coming from outside the house. We soon saw a shadow in the light, and then all at once the light shook and went out. We turned and ran into the front room and grabbed the light and anything we could use as a non-lethal weapon and bolted outside to the area from which the sound was coming from. It was coming from just under the window, but there was nothing there. There was no sound, no light, but my floodlight was unscrewed in on my porch, which really freaked us out. So I quickly put the light back up, and we had a brief look around when it began raining pretty hard. We stopped our search and came to the conclusion that whoever or whatever unscrewed this thing was gone. We assumed it didn't want to stay in the rain, as we didn't either. We got back inside thinking about what had just happened. As I went to look out the window, I saw what looked to be a man standing in the dark looking at me from behind the shack in my backyard. I was scared, I won't lie, but I kept talking to Joe as if I didn't see him. I walked over to Joe, who was at my desk, and I calmly told him what I saw, and retrieved the 9mm handgun I had for home protection due to previous incidents. I stow it in my lap, and hoped that whoever it is outside would just leave. It seemed like he had, for about an hour, until we heard loud footsteps on my porch near the floodlight, and then a series of loud banging on my wall, right where we were sitting. I stood up and cocked my handgun when I saw the outside light go out again. I moved to the window and shoved nearly my whole upper body out of the window and fired at least 7 shots right under the house outside the light. I saw the man run into the woods wildly off into the dark again. Silence and darkness crept over us again for the remainder of the night. We kept the lights on and the window shut, and nothing else happened. All has been quiet ever since. Thanks for listening to these creepy and allegedly true deep woods stories sent in by viewers just like you. Honestly, that last one has to be my favorite this time. Somebody messing with your house in the middle of nowhere, trying to get in, and then you just unload on them. Whoa, that sounds crazy. Personally, I don't think I would ever just unload on somebody, but I would definitely let off a few shots in the air potentially to try to scare them away. Anyways, if you enjoyed these stories, please be sure to hit that like button as it helps me out a ton in the YouTube algorithm. If you're new to the swamp, why not join us? Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications to never miss a new video, as I upload them almost every single day, and on things natural and supernatural. If you listen to us on iTunes, Spotify, or any other platform, you can also follow us on those as well. Leave us a 5-star rating if you can, that really does help. You can also download your favorite Swamp Dweller scary stories on iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher Radio, and pretty much anywhere else you listen to podcasts online. If you want to support the Swamp even further, you can check us out on our merch store. We have shirts, hoodies, mugs, and even face masks for the Rona time. Thank you guys, as always, for always supporting the Swamp the way you do. It's stories like yours that keep this show going. If you have a story that you would like to share in a future video, be sure to submit that at swampdweller.net or the email you can find in the description down below. I'll see you guys soon. with another creepy video.